You think you know how a story like this goes? A lone woman, a rifle, and a gang of armed riders closing in. You figure it ends one of two ways, with her as a hero or with her in a shallow grave. But you'd be wrong, because the story of Eleanor Warren isn't about that one moment. It's about every single thing that led her there, and every single secret she was hiding behind that rifle. It started with a standoff. 15 riders, their faces hard as the New Mexico dirt, their horses kicking up dust that glowed red in the setting sun. They sat there, a silent promise of violence, their eyes fixed on the woman standing alone in front of a small weathered cabin. She was pregnant, her belly round and heavy under a simple cotton dress, but the rifle in her hands didn't shake, not even a little. Behind her, on the porch, a man with a scarred face held another rifle, his eyes locked on the riders. And next to him stood 6 children, the oldest a boy barely tall enough to hold the shotgun he was gripping, his knuckles white. These children belong to me. Eleanor's voice cut through the silence, steady and clear. And I will die before I let you take them. The leader of the riders, a tall man with silver buttons gleaming on his coat, just smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile that didn't reach his eyes. That can be arranged, ma'am. The wind whispered through the long, tense seconds. The sun dipped lower, and then the first shot rang out, echoing across the desert like the crack of doom. But to understand how they got to that shot, you have to go back. 8 months back, to a different kind of storm. The wind howled like a dying animal, throwing sand against the windows of Eleanor's tiny cabin. She was alone, truly alone, out at the edge of nowhere. And a storm was raging inside her too. A contraction gripped her body, sharp and fierce. She braced herself against the rough wooden table, sweat beading on her forehead. The baby was coming. Tonight. At 33, she wasn't young for this, but she'd done it before. 3 times. But those times were different. There was a midwife. There was her husband, Daniel, pacing and worrying. There were excited siblings waiting. Now there was just Eleanor, alone in a cabin that felt like it might get ripped apart by the wind. Another wave of pain washed over her, and she whispered to the life inside her. Just you and me, little one. We'll get through this. She had everything ready, clean linens, boiled water, a knife, sterilized in the fire. She'd prepared for this moment for months, carrying this child, this secret, this unexpected piece of hope. It was a life she hadn't planned for, a life born from violence and pain, but she had chosen to love it. It was the only choice she had left in a world that had taken everything else. As the pain eased for a moment, she moved to check the back door, to make sure it was latched tight against the storm. And that's when she heard it. A sound that wasn't the wind. A low, hungry growl that sent a spike of ice through her veins. She froze. One hand went to her belly. The other reached for the rifle she always kept loaded by the door. Through the dusty window, she saw a gray shape slinking through the storm. A wolf. Gaunt. Desperate. Its ribs showing through its mangy fur. Hunger had driven it down from the hills, right to her door. Another contraction hit, so strong it nearly buckled her knees. The wolf smelled it. It sensed weakness. It circled closer, its eyes glowing like amber coals in a flash of lightning. Gritting her teeth, Eleanor raised the rifle. Her body screamed in protest, but her hands were steady. She remembered Daniel's voice from years ago, teaching her to shoot. Exhale as you squeeze. The bullet flies true when your body is emptying, not filling. The wolf took one more step. Eleanor fired. The crack of the shot was swallowed by the storm. The wolf dropped. Just like that. She stood there for a second, the rifle smoking in her hand, her body caught in a strange, terrible balance between taking a life and creating one. Then the next contraction hit, harder than all the rest, and she knew it was time. She stumbled back inside, the rifle clattering to the floor. The world dissolved into a blur of pain and grit and the howling of the wind. She bit down on a piece of leather, refusing to scream into the emptiness. There was no one to hear her. Just before dawn, as the storm finally began to quiet, her daughter was born. She was tiny, and she was blue. The cord was wrapped around her neck. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through Eleanor's exhaustion. She worked frantically, her fingers trembling as she unwound the cord, cleared the tiny mouth. She breathed into the baby's lungs, trying to force life into the still little body. Please, she begged, her voice a raw, broken whisper. Please, little one. Don't you leave me too. But the baby never cried. She never opened her eyes. Eleanor held her daughter, her tiny, perfect daughter, until the small body grew cold. She named her Hope, because for 9 months, that's what this child had been. A reason to keep going, a reason to live. Now that hope was gone. When the sun was fully up, she wrapped Hope in a soft blanket she'd spent months embroidering with tiny wildflowers. She carried the small bundle outside, to the little grove behind the cabin. There were 3 wooden crosses there already. Daniel, her husband, William, her firstborn, Sarah and Joshua, the twins. Fever had taken them all, 3 years ago. The ground was still soft from the rain, and the digging was easier than usual. Her body ached, a deep, hollow ache from the birth. But she didn't stop. She dug until the grave was ready. I'm sorry, she whispered as she laid the bundle in the earth. I'm sorry you never got to see the wildflowers bloom. Her voice caught. I'm sorry you never got to meet your father. She paused. That wasn't quite true, was it? This child didn't have a father. Not in any real sense. Just a faceless man from a raid on a supply wagon. A man who had taken what wasn't his. A man she had killed right after. It was the first time she'd taken a human life. She didn't regret it. When she found out she was pregnant months later, her first thought was despair. But then something else took over. A stubborn refusal to be broken. A refusal to let anyone else decide her fate. So she'd chosen to carry this child. To love it. It was her choice. Her one remaining piece of defiance. She made a small cross from 2 pieces of wood and carved the name, Hope Warren, the 4th cross in a row. Too many crosses for one woman to tend. She stood there until the sun was high in the sky. Then she turned her back on the graves and walked to the empty cabin. Her shoulders were straight. Her face was a mask. She would give herself one day to be a grieving mother. Just one. Tomorrow she would be a survivor again. 2 weeks went by. 2 weeks of silence and ghosts. Eleanor moved through her days like a phantom, doing the chores that kept her alive. Tending the garden, checking her traps, mending clothes. Her body was healing, but the emptiness inside just seemed to get bigger. She talked to herself, to Daniel, to the children, to Hope. It wasn't madness, she told herself. It was just a refusal to let the silence win. On the 15th day, she was hanging laundry when she saw it, smoke rising in the eastern sky. It was too much for a cooking fire, too black. Someone's home was burning. Her first instinct was to ignore it. Other people's troubles weren't her problem. She'd learned that the hard way. The last time she'd gone to help a neighboring family, raiders had hit her cabin and taken what little food she had. But the column of smoke kept rising, a dark stain against the bright blue sky. It was an ugly, angry-looking smoke. With a heavy sigh, she went inside. She strapped on her holster and her revolver. She saddled her horse, Willow, and packed a small bag with medical supplies. Old habits from her time as a nurse during the war died hard. It took 2 hours to reach the source of the smoke. She approached carefully, using the rocks and scrub brush for cover. The smell hit her first, burning wood, and something else, something much worse. When she crested the last rise, she saw it. A homestead, completely destroyed. The house was a smoldering ruin. The barn was a pile of charred timbers. And nearby, a herd of cattle lay slaughtered in the field, their bodies already attracting vultures. And then she saw the men, 3 of them, tied to the fence posts, spread-eagled under the brutal sun. A man and 2 young boys. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a raid. This was an execution. A slow, cruel one. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to ride away and forget what she'd seen. Whoever did this could still be nearby. But then she saw it. The man's chest rose and fell. A tiny, weak movement. But it was there. He was alive. Cursing under her breath, Eleanor urged Willow forward. Her hand never left the grip of her revolver. As she got closer, she could see how bad it was. The man had been beaten horribly. His face was a swollen, bloody mess. The boys, one maybe 10 and the other 7, were sunburned and dehydrated, their lips cracked and bleeding. Mister, she called out softly, dismounting. Can you hear me? The older boy turned his head. His eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and a tiny flicker of hope. He tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. Water, she understood. She grabbed her canteen and held it to his lips, letting him take small sips. Easy now. Please, the boy croaked. Help Papa. Eleanor nodded and moved to the man. His wrists were raw where the ropes had cut into his flesh. Sir, I'm going to cut you down, she said, pulling out her knife. He didn't respond, but when she sliced through the first rope, a groan of pure agony escaped his lips. She worked fast, freeing his other arm, then his feet. He collapsed against her, a dead weight she could barely hold. She gently lowered him to the ground and went for the boys. What's your name? She asked the older one as she cut his ropes. Thomas, he whispered. That's my brother, James, and my father, Samuel. I'm Eleanor, she said, catching Thomas as his legs gave out. How long have you been here? Since yesterday, he said, his voice trembling. They came at dawn. A cold fury settled in Eleanor's stomach. Over a day in this heat. It was a miracle any of them were still alive. She had one horse and 3 people who couldn't walk. She couldn't take them all, and she couldn't leave any of them behind. Thomas, she said, her voice firm, I'm taking your brother first. He's the smallest. I'll come back for you and your father as fast as I can. The boy shook his head, a look of sheer terror on his face. Don't leave Papa. They might come back. Eleanor looked at the unconscious child, then at the barely breathing man. Thomas was right, but she couldn't carry Samuel by herself. Then take Papa, Thomas insisted, his voice suddenly strong. I'll watch James. Please. She saw a fierce determination in the boy's eyes, the look of a child who had been forced to grow up way too fast. All right, she said. I'll be as quick as I can. There's more water in my saddlebag, just small sips. It took every ounce of her strength to haul the unconscious man onto Willow's back. The ride to her cabin was a slow, grueling nightmare. Samuel groaned with every jolt, but he never woke up. By the time she got him inside and onto her bed, she was exhausted, but she didn't rest. She cleaned his wounds. She set his dislocated shoulder with a sharp, practiced movement that made him cry out in his delirium. She stitched a deep gash on his forehead. As she worked, she talked to him, her voice low and steady. You're lucky I saw that smoke, mister. Another day and you'd have been nothing but a feast for the buzzards. When she had done all she could, she left him water and raced back for the boys. The sun was already setting when she found them, huddled together in the meager shade of a fence post. James was awake now, but his eyes were glassy with fever. Your father's safe, she told Thomas. Let's get you home. She lifted James onto the saddle in front of her, his small body burning with heat. Thomas walked alongside, his hand clutching the stirrup, never letting go. Who did this to you? She asked quietly as they moved through the twilight. Thomas's face hardened. Men came, said Papa owed money to someone. When he said he didn't, they started breaking things and hitting him. He swallowed hard. They burned everything. Said it was a message, that debts always get paid. The boy looked up at her, his eyes old and full of a terrible knowledge. But my Papa doesn't owe anybody. We keep to ourselves. Some men don't need a reason to be cruel, Eleanor said, her voice grim. They just need an excuse. It was late when they finally reached the cabin. She settled the boys down, making a pallet for Thomas on the floor near his father. Will he be okay? Thomas asked, his gaze fixed on Samuel's still form. He's strong, Eleanor said, trying to sound more certain than she felt. Now get some sleep. You're safe here. After they were all settled, Eleanor sat at her small table, staring into a cup of cold coffee. Her quiet, empty life had been invaded. She had brought 3 strangers into her home, strangers with powerful enemies, enemies who might come looking for them, enemies who might find her. She looked at the sleeping family. They were alive because of her. In a world that had only ever taken from her, she had saved something. She didn't know if that made her a fool or a hero. She sighed and picked up her rifle, settling into the rocking chair by the dying fire. She would watch over them, just for tonight. But as she sat there in the dark, A cold, unsettling thought began to form in her mind. She had seen the smoke, yes. But what if that wasn't the only reason she had ridden out there? What if she hadn't just stumbled upon them by chance? What if she had been looking for them all along? Samuel Holloway woke up to a world of pain. Every breath was a sharp stab in his ribs. A dull, heavy throbbing pulsed in his shoulder. For a terrifying moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then it all came flooding back. The riders, the smoke, his son's screams. "Thomas!" he croaked, trying to sit up. "James! They're safe!" A woman's voice, calm and steady. "Don't try to move. You'll make it worse." He turned his head and saw her. A woman with auburn hair streaked with gray, her face weathered like the landscape outside. Her eyes were the color of a stormy sky. "Where am I?" he rasped. "My home," she said, helping him sip some water. "I'm Eleanor Warren." "Samuel Holloway," he managed. Relief, so powerful it almost made him dizzy, washed over him. "My boys. The younger one, James, has a fever, but he's resting. Thomas is right there." She nodded toward a pallet on the floor where Thomas was sleeping. Tears pricked at Samuel's eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick. "You saved us." Her expression didn't change. "You were lucky I saw the smoke. Who were those men?" Samuel closed his eyes, the memory still raw. "They said I owed money. To a man named Cross. Jeremiah Cross. When I told them they had the wrong man, they destroyed everything." "Did you recognize them?" "No. We're new to this territory. We came from Missouri, after my wife passed." Eleanor just nodded. "You should rest." As she stood to leave, Samuel grabbed her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Why?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "Why did you help us?" She looked down at his hand, then back at his face. Her gaze was unreadable. "I know what it's like to be left to die alone," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She pulled her wrist free. "No one came for us." And then she was gone, leaving him alone with her cryptic words and the throbbing in his shoulder. The next few days were a blur of pain and fever for Samuel. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he'd wake to see Thomas sitting by his bed, his young face etched with worry. Other times it was Eleanor changing his bandages with efficient, no-nonsense hands. He learned more about her in bits and pieces, mostly from his sons. James's fever broke on the second day, and as he started to explore the small cabin, he began to ask questions. He found a faded photograph of a handsome man with kind eyes. "Was this your husband?" he asked. "Yes," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "His name was Daniel." "Where is he?" Eleanor's gaze drifted toward the window, to the 4 crosses on the hill. "He died 3 years ago. Him and our children. A fever." James's eyes went wide. "All of them?" "All of them," she confirmed, her voice flat, as if she were talking about the weather. That evening, Samuel felt strong enough to get out of bed. He found Eleanor by the hearth, stirring a stew that smelled rich and savory. "I've imposed on you long enough," he said, easing himself into a chair. A faint, humorless smile touched her lips. "You've been alone for 3 years, Mr. Holloway," she said. "I've learned to live with danger." He nodded, a sudden kinship forming between them. They were both survivors, both haunted by loss. "My wife, Catherine," he started but didn't know how to finish. He didn't have to. The understanding was there in the quiet space between them. Just then, James and Thomas came into the room, their faces lighting up when they saw him awake and sitting up. For the first time in days, Samuel felt a flicker of hope. He gathered his boys into a one-armed embrace, a lump forming in his throat. Eleanor turned away from the scene, her back to them. "We'll leave as soon as I'm able," Samuel said, addressing her back. She turned to face them, her expression unreadable. "And go where? Your farm is gone, and the men who did this might still be looking for you." He had no answer. "You can stay here," she said, as if it were the most practical thing in the world. "Until you're healed, until you have a plan." That night Samuel couldn't sleep. The pain in his ribs had subsided to a dull ache, but his mind was racing. He saw Eleanor slip out of the cabin, and moved by a strange impulse, he followed her. He found her in the small graveyard, kneeling before the newest, smallest cross. "I'm sorry," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. I didn't mean to intrude. She looked up, her face etched with a grief so profound it stole his breath. It's fine. I, I come here to talk to them. He hesitated, then said, the youngest one, was it recent? 2 weeks ago, she said, her voice hollow. She was stillborn. A wave of shock and shame washed over him. This woman who had just lost a child, who should have been in bed recovering, had ridden out alone, faced down unspeakable horror, and dragged 3 strangers to safety. You shouldn't have been carrying me, he said, his voice thick with guilt. A bitter smile twisted her lips. There was no one else to do it. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the chirping of crickets in the tall grass. The desert night was cool and peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil in both their hearts. Then Samuel decided to ask the question that had been burning in his mind, the detail that didn't quite fit. A few days before the attack, he said, his voice casual, I saw someone watching my farm, from the ridge to the west, a lone rider. I have good eyes. I'm sure it was you. Eleanor stiffened. She didn't look at him. She stared out at the dark mountains on the horizon. I like to know who my neighbors are, she said, her voice tight. It's a long ride just to check on a neighbor, he pressed gently. The desert makes its own rules about distance, she replied, her voice cold. He let the silence stretch. Then he played his last card. The men who attacked us, he said, his voice low. The name they mentioned, Jeremiah Cross. Does it mean anything to you? He watched her face carefully in the moonlight. For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. A flash of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was there, and then it was gone, replaced by the same blank mask she always wore. No, she said, her voice perfectly even. The name means nothing to me. Samuel knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was lying. This woman hadn't just saved them. She was connected to this. Somehow. The attack on his farm, the name Jeremiah Cross, her presence on that ridge. It was all part of a much bigger, much darker story, and they were standing right in the middle of it. Life in the small cabin fell into a strange, tense rhythm. On the surface, things were calm. Samuel was healing. The boys, James and Thomas, were slowly recovering from their ordeal, the shadows in their eyes beginning to recede. They helped Eleanor with chores, gathering firewood, tending her small garden. But underneath the quiet routine, a current of suspicion was growing stronger every day. Samuel watched Eleanor. He saw the way her eyes would constantly scan the horizon when she was outside, the way she moved with the quiet, deadly grace of a predator. She was a woman who was used to watching her back. He noticed she never talked about her past, not really. She'd mentioned her husband, Daniel, but the stories were vague, like faded photographs, with the details blurred out. Thomas was suspicious, too. The boy was sharp, and he missed nothing. One afternoon, while helping Eleanor mend a fence, he saw her clean her rifle. Her movements were too fast, too efficient. It wasn't the way a simple homesteader handled a gun. It was the way a soldier did. Later that week, Thomas was exploring a small dusty shed behind the cabin. Tucked away in a dark corner, under a pile of old sacks, he found a locked wooden box. It was heavy. He couldn't get it open, but he could hear something shifting inside when he shook it. Something that clinked like metal. He told his father about it that night, his voice a hushed whisper. She's hiding something, Papa. I know it. Samuel didn't dismiss his son's fears. He'd seen enough to know that Eleanor Warren was far more than she appeared. But what was her secret? And did it put them in more danger? The answer came a few days later, and it came in the form of a lone rider. They saw him coming from a long way off, a dark speck moving slowly across the shimmering heat of the desert floor. Eleanor saw him first. She was chopping wood, and she suddenly went still, her axe held motionless in midair. Get inside, she said, her voice low and urgent. Both of you, take the boys. Go to the back room and stay quiet. Who is it? Samuel asked, his hand instinctively going to the rifle that now leaned against the cabin wall. Just do it, she snapped, her eyes never leaving the approaching rider. Samuel herded his sons inside, his heart pounding. He peered through a crack in the wall. The rider was closer now. He was a rough-looking man, with a long, dusty coat and a mean-looking scar that ran down his cheek. He reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin and stared at Eleanor. "That's a long way from anywhere, ma'am," the man called out, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Depends on where you're going," Eleanor replied, not moving. The axe was still in her hand. "I'm looking for a man, Samuel Holloway, and his two boys. Heard they might have come this way after a little misunderstanding at their farm." Samuel's blood ran cold. It was one of them, one of Cross's men. "Never heard of him," Eleanor said, her voice flat. The man smiled, a slow, ugly twisting of his lips. "That's funny, 'cause that horse in your corral, it looks a lot like the one Holloway used to own." Eleanor didn't even glance at the corral. Her eyes were locked on the man. "A lot of horses look alike." "Maybe," the man said. He swung down from his saddle. "Mind if I have a look around, just to be sure?" "I do mind," Eleanor said. The man laughed. "I don't think you're in a position to mind much, ma'am." He started walking toward her, his hand drifting down toward the pistol holstered on his hip. Samuel raised his rifle, trying to get a clear shot through the crack in the wall. But the man was moving and Eleanor was in the way. "That's close enough," Eleanor said. Her voice was deadly quiet. The man kept coming. "I'm a thirsty man. I'm sure you wouldn't deny a thirsty man a little hospitality." He was 10 feet from her now. His hand was on his gun. And then it happened. So fast Samuel almost couldn't follow it. Eleanor dropped the axe. In the same fluid motion, she drew the revolver from the holster that had been hidden by her apron. She didn't aim. She just fired. The shot was deafening. The man grunted, a look of pure shock on his face. He staggered back, clutching his chest, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. He tried to draw his own gun, but his fingers were clumsy. Eleanor fired again. The second shot hit him square in the forehead. He dropped like a stone in the dust. Silence. The only sound was the buzzing of flies and the nervous snorting of the dead man's horse. Eleanor stood over the body for a long moment, the smoking gun still in her hand. Then she calmly walked over, checked to make sure he was dead, and began rifling through his pockets. Samuel stumbled out of the cabin, his sons close behind him. They stared at the body, then at Eleanor. She looked up at them, her face a cold, hard mask. She wasn't a grieving widow. She wasn't a simple homesteader. She was a killer. "You lied to us," Samuel said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and awe. "You said you didn't know who Jeremiah Cross was." Eleanor didn't deny it. She pulled a worn leather pouch from the dead man's coat. "He sent this man to finish the job, to make sure you and your boys were dead." "Who are you?" Samuel demanded. Eleanor looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the truth in her eyes. Not just grief, but a burning, all-consuming rage. "My name is Eleanor Warren," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed fury. "And Jeremiah Cross didn't just run you off your land. He murdered my husband. He murdered my children. And he left me for dead." The story poured out of her then, a torrent of grief and fury held back for 3 long years. Jeremiah Cross wasn't just some outlaw. He and her husband Daniel had been partners. They had bought this land together, planning to build a town. They had discovered a rich vein of silver in the hills. It was supposed to be their future, their legacy. But Cross was greedy. He wanted it all. One night, he and his men came to their home. It wasn't a fever that killed her family. It was Cross. He shot Daniel in cold blood. He set fire to the house with her children still inside. Eleanor had fought back. She managed to wound one of the men before they overwhelmed her. They beat her, left her for dead in the burning ruins of her life, and rode off into the night. They concocted the story about a fever outbreak to explain the deaths and to scare anyone else away from the land. But Eleanor hadn't died. She had crawled from the ashes, her body broken, but her will forged into something as hard and sharp as steel. The child she had been carrying, Hope, was not Daniel's. It was a brutal reminder of that night, a consequence of the violence inflicted by one of Cross's men. She had spent the last 3 years in hiding, living in this remote cabin, healing, training, and watching, waiting. "I wasn't just checking on my neighbors when I was on that ridge," she confessed, her eyes burning into Samuel's. "I was watching you. Cross sold you my land, the land he stole from me. I needed to know who you were. I needed to know if you were one of his men." Samuel stared at her, stunned into silence. Everything made sense now. Her skills, her secrecy, the cold fire in her eyes. She wasn't a survivor. She was an avenger. When his men attacked you, she continued, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, I knew my time for hiding was over. Cross made a mistake. He came back to my land. He reminded everyone that he was still here. And now I'm going to finish what he started. The air crackled with a new, terrifying energy. They were no longer just a group of refugees huddled together for safety. They were an alliance, forged in blood, and a shared desire for vengeance. The man she had just killed wasn't just a threat. He was a message, a declaration of war. Eleanor looked from the dead man on the ground to Samuel and his sons. He will send more men, she said, her voice a cold statement of fact. They won't stop until we're all dead. We can't run. We can't hide. A grim smile touched her lips. So we'll hunt. The war began not with a bang, but with a plan. The next few days were a blur of intense preparation. Eleanor's small, quiet cabin transformed into a command center. She was no longer just their protector, she was their general. And Samuel, who had been a captain in the army, found himself falling back on old training, his mind sharp and strategic. They were a strange but effective team. Eleanor knew the land like the back of her hand. Every canyon, every dry riverbed, every hidden spring. She knew Cross's habits, having studied him from afar for 3 years. Samuel knew tactics. He knew how to build fortifications, how to set traps, how to think like an enemy commander. Even the boys had a role. James, small and quick, became their lookout, perched in a tall pine tree with a pair of old field glasses. Thomas, his young face now grim and determined, learned how to load rifles and make cartridges, his hands working with a speed that belied his age. Their first move was to deal with the evidence. They buried the dead rider and his horse in a deep ravine miles away, leaving no trace. Then they began to turn the cabin and the land around it into a fortress. They dug trenches. They built barricades of rock and timber. They set snares and tripwires along the main trails leading to the cabin, but they all knew that defense wasn't enough. To win, they had to go on the offensive. They had to take the fight to Cross. He has a weakness, Eleanor explained one evening, spreading a crude, hand-drawn map on the table. The silver mine. It's his entire reason for being here. It's his source of power. If we hit the mine, we hit him where it hurts. Their target was a weekly supply wagon that brought food, tools, and most importantly, blasting powder to the mine. It was always lightly guarded, a soft, predictable target. It's too risky, Samuel argued. There could be a dozen men. There will be 4, Eleanor said with absolute certainty. 2 driving, 2 riding shotgun. Always the same. They've gotten lazy, complacent. Her confidence was unnerving, but Samuel had learned not to question her intelligence. 3 days later, they were in position, hidden among the rocks, overlooking a narrow pass the wagon had to travel through. The plan was simple and brutal. They would create a rock slide to block the pass, then take out the guards in the ensuing confusion. The wait was agonizing. The sun beat down on them, and the silence of the desert was broken only by the sound of their own breathing. Then they heard it, the rumble of wheels and the jingle of harnesses. The wagon came into view just as Eleanor had described. 4 men. Samuel gave the signal. He and Thomas, hidden on the opposite side of the pass, shoved against a series of precariously balanced boulders they had prepared earlier. With a deep groan, the rocks gave way, tumbling down into the pass with a deafening roar. The wagon horses screamed and reared. The guards shouted in confusion, their guns drawn, their eyes searching the cliffs above. That's when Eleanor opened fire. Her first shot took out one of the shotgun riders before he even knew what was happening. Samuel's shot hit the second one a moment later. The 2 drivers dove from the wagon, scrambling for cover behind the wheels. But Eleanor was already moving. She slid down the rocky slope like a mountain cat, firing as she went. One of the drivers cried out and fell, clutching his leg. The other threw down his gun, his hands raised in surrender. It was over in less than a minute. They tied up the 2 surviving men, one of them moaning in pain from his shattered leg. The other, a young man with fear-widened eyes, was shaking uncontrollably. "Where is Cross?" Eleanor demanded, her pistol pressed against the young man's temple. I don't know, he stammered. He's at the main camp by the mine. How many men does he have left? 15, maybe 20 now. He hired more after Abe didn't come back. So the dead rider's name was Abe. It was a strange, humanizing detail. They took what they could from the wagon, the blasting powder, rifles, ammunition, and food. Then came the hard part. We can't let them go, Eleanor said, her voice cold. They'll go straight back to Cross. Samuel looked at the two terrified men. He had killed in the war, but this felt different. This was an execution. There has to be another way. There isn't, she said, her eyes like chips of flint. She raised her pistol. No! Thomas cried out, stepping forward. He had watched the ambush with a kind of grim fascination. But this was too much. Don't. Please. Eleanor looked at the boy. She saw the horror on his face, and for a moment, the icy mask on her own face cracked. She lowered the gun. She walked over to the horses, cut them free from their harnesses, and sent them scattering with a loud slap. Then she turned back to the men. Start walking, she said, her voice flat. Your boss is that way. She pointed back the way they had come. It's a 2-day walk without water. If you make it, tell Jeremiah Cross that Eleanor Warren is coming for him. Tell him I'm coming to take back what's mine. She watched as the two men stumbled away, one of them half carrying his wounded companion. Then she turned to the wagon full of blasting powder. Now, she said, a grim smile playing on her lips. Let's send him a message he can't ignore. They didn't go back to the cabin. They went straight for the mine. Under the cover of darkness, Eleanor and Samuel crept toward the main entrance. The camp was in an uproar over the missing supply wagon. Men were shouting, lanterns were swinging back and forth. It was the perfect diversion. They planted the charges from the stolen blasting powder all around the mine's entrance, a place where the rock face was already unstable. Eleanor worked with a calm, terrifying expertise, her hands sure and steady as she set the fuses. They lit the fuses and ran, melting back into the shadows of the surrounding hills. They were a safe distance away when the world exploded. A huge, brilliant flash of orange light lit up the night sky, followed a second later by a boom that shook the very ground beneath their feet. They watched as the entire cliff face above the mine entrance collapsed, tons of rock and earth sealing the mine completely. A chorus of enraged and terrified shouts rose from the camp below. Jeremiah Cross's silver mine, the source of all his wealth and power, was gone, buried. They had cut off the head of the snake, but they knew the snake wasn't dead yet, and now it was wounded, cornered, and furious. It would be coming for them, all of it. The ride back to the cabin was silent and tense. The victory at the mine felt hollow. They hadn't won a war, they had just started one, and they were horribly, terrifyingly outnumbered. They arrived back at the cabin just before dawn. James, who had been keeping watch, ran out to meet them, his face pale with fear. They're coming, he said, his voice a terrified squeak. I saw them, a lot of them, from the east. Eleanor and Samuel exchanged a grim look. There was no time to rest, no time to prepare. The final battle was here. Eleanor ran into the cabin and came back out, her arms full of rifles. She handed one to Samuel, one to Thomas. She checked the loads on her own rifle and her revolver. Thomas, she said, her voice low and steady, you and James, get in the trench behind the house. Don't fire unless they get past us. Do you understand? Thomas nodded, his face grim. He looked like a man now, not a boy. Eleanor and Samuel took up their positions behind the barricade of rocks they had built in front of the cabin. They lay on their stomachs in the dirt, rifles resting on the stones, and waited. As the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and orange, they appeared on the horizon. A long line of riders, at least 15 of them, spread out and moving fast. At their head was a tall man on a black horse, Jeremiah Cross. They were coming straight for the cabin. There was no more hiding, no more running. This was the same scene that had played out in Eleanor's nightmares for 3 years. The riders, the cabin, the overwhelming odds. But this time, she wasn't alone. She looked over at Samuel, his scarred face set in a grim line of determination. She thought of the 2 boys huddled in the trench behind her, ready to fight for their lives. This wasn't just her fight for vengeance anymore. It was their fight for a future. "Steady," she whispered, as much to herself as to Samuel. The riders were closer now, close enough to see their faces. They were hard, cruel men, confident in their numbers. They slowed their horses to a walk, fanning out to surround the small cabin. Jeremiah Cross rode forward, stopping about 50 yards away. He was just as she remembered him, arrogant, smirking. The silver buttons on his coat gleamed in the morning sun. "Eleanor," he called out, his voice booming across the small clearing. "I know you're in there. I have to admit, you've caused me more trouble than I expected. But the game is over." Eleanor didn't answer. She just lined up the sights of her rifle on the center of his chest. "Come on out, Eleanor," Cross shouted. "Come out, and I might let the man and the boys live. Might." "Don't listen to him," Samuel muttered, his own rifle aimed and ready. "I know," she whispered back. The silence stretched. Cross was growing impatient. He raised his hand, ready to give the signal to attack. And in that moment, Eleanor made a choice. This wouldn't be a siege. It wouldn't be a defensive battle. She was going to end this the way she had lived for the last 3 years, on her own terms. She stood up. She stepped out from behind the barricade, her rifle held steady at her shoulder. She stood alone in the yard, a single, defiant figure against the backdrop of the rising sun. Cross lowered his hand, a look of surprise on his face. He hadn't expected this. "There you are," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Come to your senses, have you?" "I've come to kill you, Jeremiah," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. He laughed, a loud, ugly sound. "You and what army?" "This one," she said, and she fired. The shot was perfect. It hit Cross square in the shoulder, knocking him backward in his saddle. His horse reared, and he fell heavily to the ground. All hell broke loose. The riders, shocked into action, spurred their horses forward, screaming and firing their guns. Bullets chewed up the dirt around Eleanor and whizzed past her head. Samuel opened fire from behind the barricade, his shots methodical and deadly. One rider clutched his chest and fell. Another screamed as his horse went down. Eleanor dropped to one knee, firing, reloading, firing again. Her movements were a blur of deadly efficiency. She wasn't just fighting. She was a storm of vengeance, a force of nature. A rider charged directly at her, his saber raised. She shot the horse out from under him, then put a second bullet in the man as he tried to scramble to his feet. From the trench behind the house, another rifle cracked. Thomas. He had taken down a rider who was trying to circle around to their flank. The initial charge was broken. The remaining riders, maybe 10 of them now, pulled back, taking cover behind rocks and trees, their confidence shattered. This wasn't the easy fight they had expected. Cross was on his feet now, clutching his wounded shoulder, his face a mask of pure rage. "Kill her!" he screamed. "Kill them all! I'll double the pay for the man who puts a bullet in her heart." The firefight became a deadly dance. The riders would try to advance, and Eleanor and Samuel would drive them back. But the odds were still against them. They were running low on ammunition. It was only a matter of time. Then Samuel had an idea. A desperate, crazy idea. "The shed!" he yelled to Eleanor over the gunfire. "The box! What's in it?" Eleanor looked at him, and he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Understanding. "Dynamite!" she yelled back. "Daniel was using it to clear stumps. I never got rid of it." That was the chance they needed. "Cover me!" Samuel shouted. He broke from the barricade, sprinting in a low crouch toward the back of the cabin. Bullets kicked up dust at his heels. Eleanor laid down a furious barrage of covering fire, forcing the riders to keep their heads down. She saw Samuel disappear into the shed. A few seconds later, he reappeared, carrying the heavy wooden box Thomas had found. He didn't run back to the barricade. He ran toward the corral where their horses and the riders' horses were milling about in a panic. Eleanor understood his plan instantly. It was brilliant, and it was suicide. He placed the box in the middle of the corral, lit the fuse, it was dangerously short, and then sprinted for the cover of a large rock outcropping. "Get down!" Eleanor screamed at the boys. She dove behind the barricade just as the world turned into white light and thunder. The explosion was immense. It tore the corral to pieces, sending splintered wood and shrapnel flying in every direction. The horses screamed. Several of the riders, who had been using the corral for cover, were thrown through the air like dolls. The surviving riders, their nerve completely broken, scrambled for their remaining horses and fled, disappearing back into the desert they had come from. The silence that followed was shocking. It was broken only by the whimpering of a wounded horse and the ringing in their ears. It was over, but not quite. Through the smoke and dust, a single figure staggered forward. Jeremiah Cross. He was bleeding from his shoulder and a dozen smaller cuts. His face was blackened with soot, but he was alive. And in his hand, he held a pistol. He raised the gun, aiming it at Eleanor as she slowly rose from behind the barricade. Samuel was too far away. Thomas was out of ammunition. Eleanor stared down the barrel of the gun, her own rifle empty. She had faced death so many times, but she had always pictured it happening here, on this land. Cross smiled, a bloody, triumphant grin. "It's over, Eleanor." And then a strange thing happened. From the doorway of the cabin, a small figure appeared. It was James. In his small hands, he held the heavy shotgun, the one that had been too big for Thomas. He had been hiding in the cabin the whole time, too scared to go to the trench. He raised the shotgun. It was shaking violently, the barrel wavering back and forth. But his small face was set with a look of pure, cold fury. Cross either didn't see him or didn't care. His eyes were locked on Eleanor. "Any last words?" he sneered. Before Eleanor could answer, there was a deafening boom. The shotgun, fired at close range, bucked so hard it knocked James flat on his back. Jeremiah Cross didn't make a sound. He just stood there for a second, a look of complete surprise on his face. Then he crumpled to the ground, a huge, ragged hole in his chest. The silence returned, deeper this time. Eleanor ran to James, who was crying, more from shock and the pain of his bruised shoulder than anything else. She knelt and held him close. Samuel and Thomas ran to join them. The four of them stood there in the middle of the carnage, surrounded by the wreckage of their battle. They were bruised, battered, and exhausted, but they were alive, and they were free. They buried the dead, all of them. They gave Cross his own shallow grave, far from the others, with no marker. Then they stood together in the little grove on the hill. Eleanor looked at the four crosses that marked her old life: Daniel, William, Sarah, Joshua, Hope. Her quest for vengeance was over. The rage that had fueled her for 3 long years was finally gone, leaving a quiet, aching emptiness in its place. Samuel came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He just gently took her hand. His touch was warm and steady. Thomas and James came and stood on her other side. And in that moment, looking at the graves of the family she had lost, Eleanor realized she had found a new one. A strange, broken, beautiful family, forged in violence and loss, but a family nonetheless. They didn't leave the cabin. They stayed. They rebuilt the corral. They patched the bullet holes in the walls. They worked the land, their land, together. The silence of the cabin was replaced by the sounds of life, laughter, arguments, the simple, everyday noises of a family. One evening, months later, Eleanor and Samuel were sitting on the porch, watching the boys play in the yard. The setting sun painted the desert in brilliant colors. "Do you ever miss it?" Samuel asked quietly. "The way things were before?" Eleanor thought for a moment. She thought of Daniel, of her children. The ache of their loss would never truly go away. But it was different now. It was a scar, not an open wound. "I miss them," she said, her voice soft. "But this is home now." She had fought her war. She had faced her demons. And she had won. Not just her land, but her life. A life she never expected to have. A life filled with hope. Real hope this time. The story of Eleanor Warren isn't a simple tale of revenge. It's a story about how sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another, more beautiful one. It's proof that even in the harshest desert, after the most brutal storms, life can find a way to bloom again. What do you think? Could you have done what she did? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this incredible story of survival and justice, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming up next.